You've also created a series of Excel databases for a number of, let's say, ancient literature, right? Starting with the Bible, you've created these databases for the Masoretic Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint, or I should say, right, actually the Septuagint is just the first 5 books, right, of the Torah, and the rest of it is technically, we call it the Old Greek, right? So Septuagint is very loosely used for the whole, right, so-called Old Testament in Greek. And then you've created a database of the so-called Old Testament, right, for the Latin Vulgate, for Jerome's Latin Vulgate, right? So we have the Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And could you tell us, what, before we get to your other databases, but these biblical ones, what do they do, right? What service do they give to scholars?
Well, the aim was to put together an easy way to search for acronyms and acrostics, and say that an acronym would be looking at the first and last letters of words in a running text to see if those the accumulation of first letters or final letters themselves make a word, or have some intelligible order. Acrostic would be looking at either the first letter of a verse or a line and going down looking at successive first letters and see, and as in several of the Psalms are acrostic, notably Psalm 119 is very famous.
Sure, yeah, alphabetic acrostic.
And acrostic can also be seen sometimes in looking at the last letters of a verse or a line, and that's usually called the telestic. There wasn't any easy way to look through a corpus such as the Masoretic text or the Vulgate. And actually, you're the one that suggested that I do this. So I set about, I think the first one was the Hebrew Bible.
That's right. Yes.
So these databases, like in Hebrew Bible, uses the regular. It's in the Excel. You have a field or a cell, and it will have all of the successive first letters in one cell, and then next to that, with all the successive last letters, and for each verse, and then at the end of for each chapter, there's a summary of the first and last letters. But for the chapter, then it also has the first and last letters of each verse. So you can very easily look for acrostics, telestics, and acronyms forward and backwards simply by entering in your search box the letters you're looking for. And I set it up so that each cell, the text string, is separated by spaces. So if you wanted to look for the Tetragrammaton, for example, you open up and I think for the Hebrew Bible, I have it separated into separate databases, one for the Torah, one for the early prophets, the latter prophets, and writings, just simply because of the size. And I have 2 separate tables, one for the Kare and one for the Ketiv, because you would have slightly different lettering for each one. Before I go further, I should mention each verse in each chapter also has word and letter counts. Sometimes the word counts become significant. But then as far as searching, then the user, whatever table you're looking at, say the Torah, bring up your Excel search box and put in the Hebrew letters in succession. For searching for the Tetragrammaton, you would put in a Yod, then a space, then a Vav, space, a Hey, space, and another Vav. And it'll look through the entire database looking for examples, either of acronyms or acrostics.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to, then you would do the reverse. You would enter in hey, hey, vav, Yoder, vav, hey. Anyway, enter the letter
Yes,
in reverse with spaces, and you would find any reverse acronyms or acrostics.
Mm-hmm.
And you would have to do the same in the Kativ tab and in the Caret tab.
Right.
There may be differences, but so far I don't know if there are any. I did it that way so that all possible connections could be found.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's what I did in the Hebrew Bible. Then you asked me to do the Vulgate. I did the same for Jerome's Vulgate, and that's all. I think that's all in one big database. The reason why I separated the Hebrew Bible at first was it seemed like when you have text that's right to left,
Mm-hmm.
Hebrew,
Yes.
sometimes Excel would get very slow.
Right.
In searching or sorting or anything, and that the same thing happened with the Quran. But the Quran was somewhat smaller.
Yes.
The Hebrew Bible is just in terms of words is over 309,000. The Quran is more like 78 or 77,000. So the Quran isn't quite as unwieldy as
more comparable to the Torah, to the first 5 books.
Yes, right, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, yes, and I'll throw in one more feature. Right. So we have this ability to search for acrostics and telestics, but also is what we call a mesostic, right? And so,
right.
And so here's one of the interesting acrostics, or actually mesostic, that I found thanks to your Masoretic text Excel database, and that was right. If we go to the opening chapter of Eicha or Lamentations, you'll notice in the first, you look at the first 4 verses. Well, first of all, we recall that chapter is an alphabetic acrostic. So, right, each verse is beginning with, the consecutive letters of the Hebrew alphabet, right, Aleph, Beit, etc. But now, if you look at the last letter of each first word, right, so we get a pattern. And now this is going to be called a mesostic instead of an acrostic. A mesostic, so it's in the middle of the stick or the line.
Right.
Right, and so going down, you have the acrostic, of course, in those first 4 verses of Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet. But now, if you go to the last letter of the first word of the 4th verse and then go up, and it's a reverse or bottom to top mesostic. That's the Yod He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton. And I think there's various arguments I've given, right, that sort of support that this looks to be intentional, especially in view of the Book of Lamentations throughout, right, is an acrostic text, and it has several well-known either horizontally encrypted acronyms of divine names, right, including the Tetragrammaton. So that's it. But this one, and there's another one also, but I won't go there for now. But this one, for instance, is nowhere in the literature, so no one's noticed this before, right? So either scholars haven't had the necessary software, or they haven't been creative enough in their thoughts, right? So let's go for a mesostic and reverse bottom to top. But in any case, that's a good example of something that of things that can be discovered that are not known, right, in the literature up to this point. Also, it also I should point out, not to be negative, but to face reality, that a scholar using these tools also has to retain a certain degree of creativity and thinking outside the box, right? Because, for instance, in the 3rd chapter of Lamentations, there is this marvelous telistic of the Tetragrammaton. But if we type in the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton, it won't come up, right? You won't get a hit because it's what I would call, it looks like a tetragrammaton permutation. And so my point is the Excel databases, to a point, can think for you, right? But there are cases where you have to be creative. Like, you know, it's like, oh, yeah, let's just type in Yod space, hey space, right? And see what happens. And so actually that is the pattern I think I found in the 3rd chapter, where it's the telestic is Yod, hey, vav, hey.
Oh,
Right.
uh-huh.
Yeah, and it's a really fascinating case. It's in verses 26 through 31. If anyone ever is listening to this wants to take a look at it, and you'll see why it's so fascinating. Because, like, the first letter involved in this telestic is the Yod of an Adonai in the open text, and the last letter in that telestic is a hey, right? But it's the hey of an explicit tetragrammaton in that verse 31. But it's even curious that it's set in verses 26 to 31, 26 being the, you know, the numerical value of the tetragrammaton. It
Yes,
really looks
you're
so
right.
much in there, looks so intentional, right? So these, you know, we still have to use a little bit of scholarly ingenuity, but these databases are really marvelous tools. And yes, you did. Let me put my reading glasses on. Just to, I want to mention another one of the little results that I got from looking at your database for Jerome's Latin Vulgate. And this is to whet people's appetite so that they'll actually go and actually download these free databases, right? And start discovering things for everyone, right? And this is something I noticed, right? So in the Vulgate, all right, so I was thinking about actually the Hebrew text of Proverbs chapter 8, verses 22 through 31. Right, that's a famous speech of Lady, we call her Lady Wisdom.
Right.
Right, very, very famous speech, very influential in Judaism, but also even Christianity. Right, this is usually applied to like Christ, you know, in Christian thinking. But anyway, the commentaries, they tend not to mention that those 10 verses actually divide into 22 stichoi, right? So immediately we're thinking, 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet.
Right.
So, but what's really fascinating is in the Hebrew text, lines the first 11 lines, so the first half, contain 155 letters. And of course, I learned this from your Hebrew database, of course. So lines 1 through 11 contain 155 letters. Well, lines 12 through 22, so the second half of it, also contain exactly 155 letters. So it really looks so intentional. But what's really interesting was, so I thought, all right, let's look at the Greek, right? Old Greek, or the Septuagint of those 22 stichoi, right? And it didn't have this even division, right? Matching letter counts for the lines. But when I looked at the Vulgate, it looks like it mimics this Hebrew feature. Of course, right? Jerome was translating the Latin Vulgate directly from the Hebrew. And right, so if you look at the Latin, as I discovered in your database, the first 11 lines, or the first half, contains 320 letters. And the last 11 lines, or the second half, contains, again, exactly 320 letters. You know, so, you know, a lot more research is needed, right? Because on this subject, because, of course, as you know, no one has ever done research into letter patterns, number patterns, acrostics, acronyms in the Latin Vulgate, right? But hey, we can start now, right? Thanks to your database. There was one more. I don't know if I pointed this out to you. Right. So one of the first things I searched for in your database for the Latin Vulgate was Deus, Latin for God, right? And in the Psalter, in the Vulgate Psalter, there was only one instance of it, right? And it incidentally, that it was in Psalm 68, verse 34, right? So it's the only verse. But the reason I point this out is that we have to, we meaning all scholars who are interested in these types of literary patterns, have to be careful with our assumptions, because my assumption was I'm going to find Deus everywhere, right? It's going to be very common, right? It's a simple sequence of letters in Latin, so I'm going to probably find 20, 30, 40, right, in the Psalter. But in fact, it's an extremely rare sequence of words. I mean, a sequence of letters, either by abstracting an initial or terminal, series of letters. And I'll read that verse, right? And keep in mind that the U and the V, right, are interchangeable in Latin,
Right.
and so maybe you'll catch it. It's in the first letter. You abstract the first letter of a series of 4 words, right? And quoniam exadivit pampares Dominus et vinctos suos non dispexit, right? So the first letter of Deus, right, is the first letter of the word Dominus, right? So that's very fitting. Dominus et is the E, vinctos,
Right.
the U or the V, suos, right? And it's fascinating. It's an interesting case, but that sequence is found either horizontally or vertically only one time, right? Of the 150 psalms in Latin. So one has to be careful with assumptions, right? Right. So, well, in any case, it's quite fascinating. You've already mentioned, I was going to introduce the topic, but you've already mentioned that you've created a database of the Arabic Quran. But I should jump in there and say that originally it's probably a couple of years ago now, you created a database for what's called the Hafs. It's the most widespread version that's used among Muslims for the Quran. The Hafs version with what is called Imale, or a simplified spelling, right? For instance, in that version will supply explicitly a lot of alifs in medial position, right, somewhere within a word, as opposed to beginning or end of a word. And so that's more of a modern way of spelling. I guess in a sense you could call it the plane, right? Plane spelling.
Okay.
Right, and then what you've recently completed just some weeks ago, my bidding was, all right, so the Hafs database, searchable database, of the so-called original, right, Hafs, right, so without the simplified spelling, right, which is called Imle. And so there you get generally fewer letters in words. And so, right, you get different letter counts, right, in a lot of verses. But in any case, of course, there's a lot of interest in the Quran, right? I think there's over 1 billion Muslims on the planet, and there's some interest in like numerical patterns. But as far as like the idea of acronyms or acrostics being present in the Quran, when one studies Quran at university, for instance, or anywhere in a traditional setting or in a Western academic setting, you are told, well, yeah, in contrast to the Bible, there are no acrostics in the Quran. So you're told that, and so you never look, right? Students are just going to believe what they're told generally, right? But in fact, with the aid of your database, right, I tried to, I did searches for what I would call techniques, scribal techniques that I found throughout the Hebrew Bible. I wanted to see if we have something similar in the Arabic text of the Quran. And sure enough, right, I found abundant instances. And I'll give you one example, which is really intriguing, right? So the third chapter, or what's called the surah of the Quran, towards the end of it, we get a lot of explicit mentions of the divine name Rabbana, so our Lord, right? And it's mentioned a handful of times. It really predominates. And so it's very curious, which I discovered through your database. If you look at the last three verses, or what I call the ayat, the last three verses of that chapter 3, you notice at the end with the letters Ra, Ba, Nun, which are the first three letters of Rabbana. And Rabbana is 4 letters, the last letter being Aleph, so terminal Aleph. Well, so where is the Aleph in this telastic? It's a telastic. Well, it's there at the end of the first verse of the next chapter. Oh. So it's sort of like this technique that joins 2 chapters together, which you can find also in the Hebrew Bible. And in fact, you look at the first and the second of the Psalms, right? So the opening of the Psalter, you'll notice that, again, this is a mesostick. If you look at verse 6 of the first Psalm, you'll see that it ends with the letter Yod. All right. So if you follow that pattern and into the first 3 verses of Psalm 2, you'll see that it completes it. It's Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. So it's like this tetragrammaton mesostick that joins together those 2 psalms. And of course, there's a lot of debate among scholars, as you know. Are those sort of like a diptych, or are they written separately? The assumption usually being that Psalm 1 is later than Psalm 2. But either compositionally or the level of redaction, presently in the form we have it, right, they are connected with this really neat tetragrammaton mesostick. And I won't, well, yeah, let me supply a little bit of detail here for scholars listening to this who may be skeptical that, this may just be random or a coincidence. There's an abundance of evidence, I think, that's indicative of it not being that way. And what I mean is there's a lot of letter and numerical patterns involving numerical values of the divine names in those 2 chapters. As briefly as possible, I'll put it this way. There are 2 tetragrammatons in Psalm 1. The first tetragrammaton is in verse 2. Now, if you count the letters beginning of verse 1, when you get to the 65th letter, that will be the Yod of Yod He Vav He in verse 2. All right, that's just curious, right? Because 65 is the numerical value of the traditional tetragrammaton substitute Adonai. Now, when you get to verse 6, to the second tetragrammaton, you will notice that its Yod is letter 26 to the end of Psalm 1. 26, right, is the numerical value of the tetragrammaton. All right, so, I mean, still curious, but, this could still all be coincidence, right? Until you realize that in Psalm 2, the first tetragrammaton is word 26, right? Now, you go to the final tetragrammaton of Psalm 2, right? And that's in verse 11, so it's a much longer psalm than Psalm 1. The last tetragrammaton in Psalm 2, if you start counting at the Yod, right, to the end of Psalm 2 will be 65 letters. So that Yod is 65th to the last letter, right? So the pattern there between Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 is the numerical is 26, is 65, 26, 26, 65. So it's a chiastic structure, okay. Right? And that's just the tip of the iceberg. You could go on, right? Because actually, so this Yod He Vav He mesostick, which starts with the last letter of the first word of verse 6, which is the last verse of Psalm 1, that's actually, if you start at verse 1 and you look at the last letter of the first word and then continue that pattern, you have, right, so that's Yod, Yod He, which are the first two letters of the Tetragrammaton, or the divine name Yah, and then Aleph Lamed, right, which is El, the short
Elohim.
form of Elohim. So
Yeah.
you have Yod, Yod He, Aleph Lamed, Yod He, Vav He. This nice mesostick going from verse 1 of Psalm 2 to verse 3 of Psalm 2. But anyway, enough of that. But that's all thanks to your database and a little bit of creative thinking on my part. But you put the two together, right? The technical resource and a little bit of creative thinking, and some really extraordinarily intriguing patterns, show up in these databases that you've created. We talked about this one before. This one I was looking at, well, of course, is very famous in the table, the genealogical table in Genesis chapter 5. Thank you. I was about to say 3, but that's still in the Garden of Eden. The genealogical table, right? These 10 generations in chapter 5, which famously, right, has the account of Enoch or Henoch. And he lived 365 years, and he was not. God took him. All this. I started counting the words in that chapter just with a yod, right, with a little stick, right, physically, right, in my Torah here. And as I was reaching the end of it, it was getting curiously close to 365. And so I was at like 350, and I said, wait, I'm just going to take a look at Keith's database. And there it was. It shows that the word total for chapter 5, that genealogical table, is 365 words.
365, yeah.
Right? And so it's, to me, it's like, yeah, that's clearly intentional in order to, on a subtle level, esoteric level, to hint at the importance of Henoch in that table, right? And well, anyway, so it's really a rich resource. See, I could have looked at it first instead of counting by hand 360 words before I confirmed it basically by looking at your database. Again, one more example. I'll give 2 examples from your Septuagint database, and I'm doing this to whet everyone's appetite who's listening. First of all, in Genesis, the first 2 verses in the Septuagint, you'll notice that there are 10 words in the Greek, or the 7 in the Hebrew, but 10 in the Greek because it's wordier, and for instance, words tend to be longer, but even the definite articles, right, are separated, right, from the nouns that follow. So we have 10 words, which is probably, it's really neat Pythagorean touch, I think. But in any case, 38 letters, but the first half of the verse divides into 19 letters, and the second half divides into 19 letters. So it's very nice and even, 19 plus 19. And then the second verse, which everyone will know is much longer than the first verse, in the Septuagint has 91 letters. Right, so it's this nice, like 19, and then, right, switch it around, you get 91. Of course, right, they're using things based on decads, right? So it's like 90 and 1. So a 10 and 9 is like transformed into 90 and 1. But anyway, so 1991, you can, by looking at the word totals and letter totals, you can, make out patterns like that. But of course, again, you have to use a little ingenuity, because if you look at your database, right, for Genesis 1:2 in the Septuagint, you'll see the letter totals for verse 1 is 38, and the letter totals for verse 2 is 91. So you don't catch it until you realize that semantically, right, verse 1 divides cleanly into 19 plus 19 letters, right? Which is significant because the Hebrew text divides cleanly, semantically, between 14 plus 14 letters, right? So it really looks like, a lot of care, right, went into that Greek translation, just as it apparently went into Jerome's Latin translation from the Hebrew. The last thing is in Exodus 3, in the Masoretic text, where Moses is asking God about his name. Look, what's your name? I'm going to have to tell this to the children of Israel. They're not going to believe me. And they're going to ask me, yeah, what is this God's name that sent you to us? And so if you look at the Masoretic text, at the final letter of a series of words there in Exodus 3, do I have it here? Let's see if I have it. Yeah. So you have towards the end of verse 13 in Exodus 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words from the end, right? You'll see li, so the preposition, right, to me, right? So what shall I say? To me, li, ma, shmo, ma. When you look at the last letters there, of course, you see yod, he, vav, he, right? So what is his name? So to me, what is his name? You see the answer, right? Now, of course, scholars debate if this is, intentional or not. But the curious thing is, if you look at Septuagint of that same verse, right? In the Septuagint of that same verse, well, you have instead of li, you have me, of course, me, and then it's followed by ti, anima, auto, right? And so there, I'll wait for you. It looks like you got your Septuagint there. You're a good scholar. So if you look at Exodus 3, verse 13, and here it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 letters to the end. All right, so T. On the alto, if you look at that, the last letters, right, are of those 3 words abstracted are iota, alpha, omega, right, which is the standard Greek version of the Tetragrammaton, in the same words and in the same direction and in the same place. It's as in the Masoretic text, right? It's in the reading direction in the Masoretic text, left to right, and it's the last letter of each of the series of words that you abstract. And here it's also the last letter of a series of words you abstract going in the plain reading direction, which is the opposite of Semitic language, right? Right to left, right here in Greek. So, right, so I discovered that by typing in, iota, alpha, omega in your Septuagint database. And it really blew me away. And I thought, well, the only incongruence there with the Hebrew is that the Hebrew has the yod in the word that precedes, li, right? And here it's me. But it will work in Greek as well if you say epsilon, iota, alpha, omega, right? For a fuller version of the Tetragrammaton in Greek, right?
Yes.
Because there's a lot of different spelling variations, right, for even the 4-letter version in Greek of the Tetragrammaton in early patristics. Some use the epsilon, others use the eta, right, the long vowel. But in any case, those are some of the really rewarding types of patterns you can find by using these databases.
That's striking. That's very striking.
Yes, it is. Now, you've also created databases for the works of Virgil and then Dante. I think that's it, isn't it? Or was there another one that I'm forgetting? Dante's Divine Comedy,
right?
The complete works of Virgil, right? And so, right. So these are good tools not only for biblical scholars but also for scholars of classical literature who are interested in Virgil and Dante, right, which is of course significantly later than Virgil. But still, we do know that at least, for instance, Dante was interested in, there are some acrostics that are known in the literature, but what I noticed this was actually what prompted me to ask you to create the database for the works of Dante, a searchable acrostics acronym database. And that is, I noticed, right, that in the final stanza of the Divine Comedy, again, it's a mesostic. If you look at the first letter of the last words, right, in this set of 3 lines, because the way that Dante does this is each stanza is composed of 3 lines together and then a separate 4th line, right? So if you look at those last 3 lines, the first letter of the first letter of the last word in each line, so technically a mesostic, is P, V, and M, right? Which really stands out because those are the initials for Publius Virgilius Maro, the full name of Virgil. And the reason this is important is because, right, in the open text, right, in the narrative of Dante's Divine Comedy, the pagan poet Virgil is his guide throughout purgatory, right? And then after purgatory, Virgil disappears, and right, his guide is the famous Beatrice, who is sort of like his symbol somehow concealing the Virgin Mary, I think. But what's fascinating is that the initials of Virgil are there in the final stanza, as if there's like this esoteric, enduring presence, right, of Virgil. And the reason that stands out is because in the works of Virgil, right, Virgil scholars are aware that Virgil himself encoded his initials, right, his 3 initials for his 4, right? So it's as if Dante here is mimicking that, and he's doing it in a very precise, very prominent place, the last stanza, right? It's so of course, I did this PVM sequence search in your database, and I won't go into the results, but that was the reason why I asked you to create that. And I hope scholars, will download that as well. Those who work with Dante. I'm not going to say much about your Virgil database because there's a large number of scholars who have published on acrostics in Virgil. So it's an open field, but there is so much more in there that I've discovered beyond what's there in the literature so far. It's really a rich resource, and instead of talking about the acrostics, like encrypted words in Virgil, what I'll say is this database you've created is very, very helpful for something that's related to that, and that is, I noticed it's very, very frequent, right, all throughout Virgil. It's very frequent that he will have, let's say, in one line he starts off with a word, and let's say the first 3 letters of that word are SIC, and then you'll notice that the next line begins with an I, and then the next line after that will begin with a C. Oh, so right, so it's sort of like what's called a gamma acrostic, right? And this is extraordinarily frequent in Virgil. I don't think scholars know this unless they have access to some kind of database, right? Because it takes an inordinate amount of time, right, to go through Virgil and look for these types of patterns. But this is very frequent, and what it is, it's usually the first several letters of a word in a line. And then that word, the letters of that word are going to be found then, right, as an acrostic, but it's incomplete, right? So it's it's an incomplete acrostic, but it's in this what's called the gamma acrostic format, but it's incomplete, right? So lots that can be done. All right. You really need to be.
Well, the longer the word, the more difficult it would be to complete the acrostic, obviously.
Yes. I've talked about this in other interviews. Right? There's what's called the famous French 19th century linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. right, his theory of the radical, what's called the radical arbitrariness of language, right, is like a cornerstone of linguistics till this day. Yeah, even though towards the end of his life, Saussure realized that theory can't be correct. Right, so he sort of but he didn't publish on that insight because he could never figure out, what to replace it with. But he had this other theory that he never published because he couldn't figure out if it was dealing with randomness or intentionality. And that is, for instance, in the Iliad, he noticed that in a passage where Agamemnon is mentioned, he noticed that before and after the mention of the name Agamemnon, the letters and the letter sequences and the phonemes of the name Agamemnon begin to proliferate, right? And then they're still proliferating after the name is mentioned, and then it sort of fizzles out, right, as the action goes on to something else. So this was, he considered this some kind of, vestige of an Indo-European poetic technique, but he couldn't figure out if it's just random, right? So, right, was it a real poetic technique or not? Well, Roman Jakobson, who was a very important Russian linguist of the 20th century, who had immigrated to America, his theory was that, well, this Saussurean anagram, and Saussure called it an anagram theory, sort of like acronym, anagram. Perhaps some of these elaborate letter patterns were not random, but they may not have been produced consciously by the poet. They could have been produced from the subliminal powers, right, of the poet, right? And so this led me to develop sort of like a threefold model, right? Because now we have to be more sophisticated. We can't just ask, well, is this acronym or acrostic intentional or random? We have to ask, well, is it intentional or random, or is it non-random yet non-intentional, right? So it could have been something that came from the subliminal powers of the poet, right, without conscious knowledge, right? And so you have extraordinary, patterns, letter patterns and sound patterns. So what I believe is that Jakobson went too far. I think that these extraordinary patterns are probably the result of a combination of the poet's subliminal powers and his conscious powers of artistry. So, right. So we don't want to shortchange, the genius of these ancient poets, but they certainly don't. It doesn't appear that they were conscious of all of the patterns that we can find in them, right? And so these like incomplete acrostics, right, that I found through your database in Virgil could be, right, maybe to a certain degree, these subliminal patterns that he maybe not had even been consciously aware of, right? Because you start a line with a certain word, and then your unconscious or subliminal level, right, it's going to have an impact, right, in your memory and in your subliminal mind, or the subliminal reaches of your consciousness, right, in the next line and then the next line after that. By virtue of the power, it's wielding, right, because of its dominant initial position. Well, anyway, right. So I've talked a lot there because I know I haven't expected you to be spending time looking for patterns in Virgil and Dante, since that's not your predominant interest. So I just thought I'd share some of the things I've discovered to motivate people to go download these databases if they're interested in these topics, these particular pieces of literature. But to get back to something where now you can contribute more to the conversation here, is there anything else you want to say about all of these databases, or any particular one in particular?
There is another classification of database that I've that's on my website, and that is the repeated lines in Homer.
All right.
And those, I have them in 4 different formats. And it relates repeated lines that are, let's say, might only appear once in the Odyssey, but or in the Iliad, but it's repeated often in the Odyssey and vice versa. Those have been my most downloaded databases from my website historically. I think I first posted them back in 2015, and they've been downloaded all over the world. Actually, I think Homer, the number of repeated lines in the Iliad is about 16%. There's 15,693 lines, and there's 16% of them are repetitions of one another. There's slightly more in the Odyssey of 21. Odyssey is 21%, but the Odyssey is also repeating some lines from the Iliad, so as well as within itself.